Get off. You don't belong on a jet like this. His mother nodded. His mistress smiled. The entire cabin fell silent as he forced his wife toward the door. She had one foot on the stairs when the pilot suddenly stood up. Moments later, the plane wasn't going anywhere. Her name was Aviation. And on the afternoon this story begins, she was standing in the narrow aisle of a private jet, holding her own small bag against her chest, while the man she married pointed at the open door, like she was something the wind had blown in off the runway. Get off, Aviation. Kofi said it slow the second time, louder. He wanted it to land. He wanted everybody in that cabin to hear it. You don't belong on a jet like this. The cabin was full. It was full of the people who were supposed to be her family. Two of his cousins sat near the back, already grinning before anything funny had happened. A couple of his business partners pretended to study their phones, but their ears were wide open. And up front, in the first row, sat his mother, Loretta. She still had her sunglasses on, indoors, on a plane, like a woman who decided long ago she should never have to look at the people beneath her. And then there was the seat by the window, the cream leather seat on the left side, third row. For 6 years, that had been Ifeoma's seat. Every flight, every trip. She always took that one because you could see the wing from there, and watching the wing slice through the clouds reminded her of something her grandfather used to say. Today, a woman named Crystal was sitting in it. Crystal in a red dress that cost more than most people made in a month. Crystal with a brand new handbag balanced on her knee. And around Crystal's neck, Ifeoma's eyes caught it and held, was a thin gold chain with a small pendant. The same chain Kofi had given Ifeoma on their second anniversary. The one she thought she'd lost. She hadn't lost it. He had taken it, and he had put it around another woman's throat. Something in Ifeoma's chest folded in on itself, but her face stayed still. Kofi, she said softly, there are people watching. Good, Loretta cut in. She pulled the sunglasses off her face and folded them with 2 fingers, like a woman about to teach a lesson. Let them watch. Maybe then you'll finally understand what everybody in this family already knows. You walked into this family with nothing, and one day you'll walk out of it with nothing. The cousins laughed. One of them said something low, and the other one snorted. Crystal turned to the window like the whole scene was beneath her. Like a wife being humiliated 3 feet away was just weather passing by. And right there, in less than a minute, Ifeoma felt all 3 knives at once. The first knife was the husband, the man who once promised her forever, now using that promise as a blade. The second knife was the family, the mother and the cousins, the cold little circle that had spent years deciding she was not enough. And the third knife was the outsider, the woman in the red dress in Ifeoma's seat, wearing Ifeoma's necklace, wearing Ifeoma's whole place in this family like a coat she had no plans to return. Triple betrayal, all in one cabin, all in a single breath. I gave you 6 years, Kofi, Ifeoma said. Here is the strange thing. Her voice did not shake. Everybody in that cabin was waiting for it to. They were waiting for the cry, the tremble, the breaking. It did not come. Not because it wasn't inside her, it was a whole ocean of it, but because she had learned, the hard way, to keep the ocean behind a wall. 6 years, she said again. And I'm giving you the door, he answered. Then he grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, he was too careful for that. Just hard enough to steer her, just hard enough to turn a grown woman around in front of a watching crowd and walk her toward the exit like a child being put out of a room. And Aviation let him. She let him move her, one step, then another, down the aisle. Her heels touched the top of the metal staircase. The hot air off the tarmac rushed up the steps and brushed her face, carrying the smell of fuel and summer and the end of something. But here is what not one person on that plane knew. Not Kofi, with his hand on her arm. Not Loretta, with her folded sunglasses. Not Crystal, in her stolen seat with the stolen necklace. The woman they were pushing down those stairs was not who any of them thought she was. She had a secret 6 years deep, a secret with a name painted right there on the tail of the very plane they were throwing her off of. If only one of them had ever stopped sneering long enough to wonder. She had one foot on the stairs, and that is when the pilot stood up. The cockpit door opened, and Captain Elijah stepped out. An older man, silver coming in at his temples, hands that had held a control yoke longer than Kofi had been alive. He had flown for this company for 30 years, longer than the cousins, longer than the partners, longer than anybody on board. And when he stepped into that cabin, his eyes did not go to Kofi. They did not go to Loretta. They went straight down the aisle to the woman at the top of the stairs. Then Captain Elijah did something no one expected. He took off his cap. "Ma'am." He said it to Aviation, only to Aviation. "Are you all right?" Kofi laughed, short and ugly. "She's fine, Captain. She's leaving. Get back in your seat. We're behind schedule." But Elijah did not turn for the cockpit. He took one slow step forward and said the words that began to turn the whole cabin upside down. "This plane," he said quietly, "isn't going anywhere. Not until I hear it from her." Silence dropped over the cabin like a heavy curtain, the kind of silence where you can suddenly hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the kind right before everything a person thinks they know starts to fall apart. Aviation turned and looked at the old pilot, and for the first time in 6 years, her eyes filled, not with weakness, not with the tears of someone defeated, but with something that looked almost like relief. As if, after carrying a secret across thousands of lonely miles, somebody had finally, quietly, reached out and picked up the other end of it. Somebody on that plane was about to learn who Aviation really was, but not yet. Because to understand how a woman ends up shoved down the stairs of this particular jet, and why she let it happen without lifting a hand, you have to go back. Back to where Aviation came from. Back to the place that made her quiet. And back to the man who made her unbreakable. So she came from a small dust road town in the south, the kind of place where the houses leaned a little to one side, and every porch held a grandmother who knew your whole business before you did. Her grandfather raised her. The whole town called him Pops. He had hands like worn leather and a laugh you could hear 2 streets over. He had spent his young years cleaning airplane hangars for other men, then fixing the engines those men couldn't. Then, against every odd stacked against a black man of his time, he built something small and impossible out of nothing but grease, faith, and pure stubbornness. A single runway, a couple of old planes held together by his own 2 hands, a name he painted on the tail himself. Money was thin in that house, thin most years. But even on the leanest evenings, Pops would take Aviation out to that little airfield at sunset. He'd lift her onto an old wooden crate so she could see over the propellers, and together they'd watch the light go gold over the runway. "You see all this sky, baby girl," he'd say. "Nobody owns it. Nobody can fence it off, That's why I love it. The ground is always trying to tell you where you belong, this side of the tracks, that side of the road. But the sky? The sky don't care where you came from. Up there, everybody's the same. The night before he passed, he called her to his bedside and pressed something small and cold into her palm. A little brass propeller pin, worn smooth and shining from 40 years of his thumb rubbing it for luck. "This is the first thing I ever built that flew," he told her, his voice thin but his eyes still bright. "Keep it close, and remember something for me. Real owners don't shout, baby girl. The river that runs the deepest makes the least noise. You hear me? The deepest river is the quietest one." Ifeoma kept that pin with her always, in the pocket of her coat, in the lining of her bag, most days, right over her heart. It was in her bag at that very moment, on that very jet. She had been a soft child, the kind who fed stray dogs from her own plate and cried during the slow church songs, the kind who truly believed that if you loved people gently enough, they'd have no choice but to love you back the same way. That gentle girl grew into Ifeoma, and the cold world she was about to walk back into, the silent cabin, the cruel husband, the smiling stranger in her seat, had spent 6 full years mistaking that gentleness for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. But she did not always feel strong. I want you to understand that. Long before the jet, there were nights this gentle woman lay awake in the dark and wondered if maybe they were right about her. To tell it true, you have to go back to the beginning of her and Kofi, because once upon a time, she loved him, really loved him. When Ifeoma first met Kofi, he was charming and broke and hungry, and there was something in his eyes that pulled at her. His father had been a pilot, a good one by every account, a man who flew cargo runs and charter trips his whole life and died still wearing the same plain wristwatch he was buried in. Kofi grew up watching his father give everything to the sky and get almost nothing back, so he made himself a promise early. He would never be poor again, not ever, not for anything. But that hunger wasn't all there was to him, not at the start. In the beginning, Kofi was tender. On their first date, he had no money, so he drove her out to a hill outside the city, and they ate gas station sandwiches on the hood of his old car and watched the planes climb out of the airport in the distance. He noticed she got quiet whenever a plane passed overhead. He didn't laugh at it. He just said, "You really love those things, huh?" And she had smiled in the dark and not told him why. He remembered the small things back then, the way she took her coffee, the songs that made her cry. When she got the flu their first winter, he sat on the bathroom floor with her all night and never complained once. He used to hold her face in both his hands and say, "One day, I'm going to give you the whole world, Ifeoma. You watch." She didn't need the whole world. She already had more than he knew, but she loved that he wanted to give it to her. That was the Kofi she married. That was the Kofi she kept looking for, long after he was gone. There was a winter morning, early in the marriage, that she returned to again and again in her mind. They had no heat in the little apartment they rented back then, before any of the money, before any of the lies. She woke up freezing and found him gone. Panic for a second. Then the door opened and there he was, snow on his shoulders, holding 2 cups of cheap coffee and a single grocery store flour he'd bought with his last few coins. "Couldn't let you wake up to nothing," he'd said, and grinned that grin. They drank the coffee under one blanket and watched the snow fall, and Ifeoma remembered thinking, "I would not trade this cold little room for any palace on earth." That was the man she kept grieving, not the one in the expensive suit who called her an assistant. the one with snow on his shoulders and his last coin spent on a flower. She spent 6 years waiting for that man to come back. He never did. And the slow, quiet death of that hope hurt her more than any insult Loretta ever threw. Because the money, the lifestyle that came once his career took off. The lifestyle she never quite explained and he never quite questioned. It changed him. First it was the cars. Then the louder friends and the longer nights. Then slowly, the way he looked at her. Like she was an old photograph from a poorer chapter of his life. A picture he was a little embarrassed to still own. And the family fed it. Loretta started it, the way she started most things. She never liked Ifeoma. A quiet girl from a dust road town was not what she'd pictured for her son. A man like Kofi needs a real woman beside him, she'd say, always just loud enough to be heard. Not some plain little thing who acts like she's better than everybody. Then came the humiliations. Small at first, then less small. There was the charity dinner, maybe a year before the jet. A big room, important people, candlelight on white tablecloths. A man came up to Kofi and asked with a warm smile, "And who's this lovely lady?" And Kofi, without missing a beat, without a flicker of shame, said, "Oh, this is Ifeoma. She helps me out. Kind of like an assistant." An assistant, his wife of 5 years. Ifeoma stood there with a glass of water going warm in her hand and felt herself disappear, right there in a room full of light. She excused herself, walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and cried into a paper towel so no one would hear. Then she fixed her face and walked back out smiling, because that is what she had learned to do. There was the Sunday the whole family gathered for Loretta's birthday. Ifeoma spent 2 days cooking. When she carried the last dish to the table, she found her chair was gone. Loretta had quietly moved her place setting to a small side table by the kitchen door, next to the children. "We ran out of room at the big table, sweetheart," Loretta said, not even bothering to hide the smile. The cousins watched. Kofi looked at his plate and said nothing. Nothing at all. And Ifeoma sat by the kitchen door and ate alone, and the food she had made all weekend tasted like ash. There was the family Christmas too. Ifeoma had bought every gift, wrapped every box, cooked from sunrise. When the family gathered to take their photo by the tree, Loretta clapped her hands and called everyone in close. "Family only," she announced, smiling sweet as poison, and gently waved Ifeoma back behind the camera. "You don't mind taking it, do you, dear? You're so good with these things." So Ifeoma held the camera. She framed them all. Kofi, Loretta, the cousins, even Crystal, who had somehow been invited. And she pressed the button and gave them their perfect family picture. Then she went into the kitchen, ran the water so no one would hear, and let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That was all she allowed herself anymore. Then she dried her hands, fixed her face, and carried out the dessert she had made, smiling like her heart wasn't lying in pieces on the kitchen floor. There was the gallery opening, a few months after that. Kofi walked in with Crystal on his arm, not hidden anymore, but smiling, proud. He introduced her to a circle of important people as "my Crystal," his hand resting low on her back, while Ifeoma stood 2 steps away holding both their coats like she'd been hired for the night. A woman leaned over and asked Ifeoma kindly, "Are you with the catering, dear?" And Ifeoma, the woman who could have bought the whole gallery and the building it stood in, simply said, "Something like that," and looked for a wall to stand against. She found one. She stood against it the rest of the night, watching her husband laugh with another woman in a room full of strangers, and not one person ever learned her name. And on the drive home that night, in the dark of the car, a terrible thought crept into her. Maybe they were right. Maybe she really was nothing. Maybe all the quiet strength her grandfather poured into her had been a lie, because here she was, a grown woman, swallowing insult after insult and calling it patience. She pressed her forehead to the cold window and asked herself the question that haunts every person who has ever been made small by someone they loved. If I'm worth so much, why do I let them treat me like I'm worth so little? She had no answer that night, only the pin in her pocket and the long, dark road home, and a husband in the front seat who never once looked back to see her crying. There was the night she found a long blonde hair on Kofi's collar and a receipt for a hotel she'd never been to. She didn't scream. She sat on the cold tile floor of the bathroom, a house everyone believed Kofi owned, a house she had quietly paid for, and she shook. She held that little brass pin in her fist so tight it left a red mark in her palm, and she whispered to her grandfather like he could still hear her. "Pops," she said, "I don't know how much more I can take." And for the first time, she let herself say the word she'd been swallowing for years: divorce. She turned it over in her mouth in the dark. It tasted like both a wound and a way out. That was the start of her breaking, and the breaking went on for weeks. But here is what the family never saw, because Ifeoma was so careful. In those same weeks, there were other things happening. Quiet things. A man in a gray suit met her twice in a coffee shop across town, slid a folder across the table, and waited while she read every page and signed at the bottom in a slow, steady hand. A phone would buzz late at night, and she would step out onto the balcony and speak low, words the family never caught, words like fleet and pensions, and no, keep my name off it, exactly like before. Once, Loretta walked into the den and found Ifeoma closing a laptop a little too quickly, and for half a second, something crossed the younger woman's face that Loretta couldn't name. Loretta decided it was guilt. It was not guilt. It was a door closing. Even Kofi noticed in his careless way. "Who keeps calling you?" he asked one night. Ifeoma just looked at him, calm as still water, and said, "Nobody you'd believe." And he shrugged and let it go, because to him she was simple, and simple women don't have secrets worth chasing. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about almost everything. Then came Crystal, out in the open now, no longer hidden. And the family closed ranks around the affair like it was a celebration. They stopped inviting Ifeomato dinners. They moved her to the back at events. They laughed at how plainly she dressed, never dreaming she could buy the room twice over. They mistook her silence for emptiness, never once imagining it was control. And one gray morning, sitting alone in that big, quiet house, Ifeoma finally made two decisions at the same time. The first decision was this. She was done. She was going to leave Kofi, for real. She had even told the man in the gray suit to prepare what needed preparing. The second decision was harder. She would not run out the back door in the night. She would not slink away small and ashamed the way they expected. No, she would let them keep showing the whole world exactly who they were, every cruel word, every cold laugh. And she would wait. Wait for the moment the universe handed her in front of witnesses to finally stop being quiet. She did not know that moment was already coming. She did not know it had a flight booked, a cabin full of people, and a captain who had been waiting 6 years to take off his cap. Now we are back inside the cabin. Ifeomat, the top of the stairs, 1 foot on the metal step. Captain Elijah in the aisle with his cap in his hand. And every face on that plane, frozen, hardly breathing. "This plane isn't going anywhere," the captain said again, "until I hear it from her." Kofi's jaw went tight. He stepped into the aisle, putting himself between the captain and the door, the way a man does when he feels control slipping through his fingers. "Captain, I don't know what's gotten into you today," he said, low and hard, "but I'm telling you to sit down and fly this plane. Right now." Captain Elijah turned to face him. Slow, calm, the kind of calm that belongs only to a man with nothing left to fear. "Son," he said, "I flew beside your father for 22 years. Best stick I ever sat next to. A good man, a humble man." He paused. "And he would be ashamed of what I just watched you do to your wife in front of all these people." Another pause. "And he would be down on his knees right now if he knew whose plane he was standing in when he did it." Kofi's brow creased. "It's my plane." "No," the captain said simply. "It never was. Not for one single day." He turned his back on Kofi and faced Aviation again. When he spoke, he kept his voice quiet, but the cabin had gone so silent that every word reached every corner. "I knew your grandfather, Miss Aviation. I knew Pops. I was one of those old pilots nobody would rehire when the company nearly went under. Too old, they said, not worth the pension. And you brought me back. You brought all of us back. Every man flying for this company today is flying because you saved it when no one else would." His eyes were shining now. "I've kept your secret 6 years, exactly like you asked, never said a word. But I will not fly this aircraft 1 inch while a man on board treats its true owner like dirt on the bottom of his shoe." The word dropped into the cabin and shattered like glass on a marble floor. Owner. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the cabin came apart. Loretta's folded sunglasses slipped out of her hand and clattered to the floor. What did he say?" she breathed, half rising from her seat. One of the business partners, a heavy-set man who had laughed loudest at the back, suddenly sat forward, his face gone pale. "Wait," he said. "Wait. The company that owns this fleet, that's the same name on the contract I signed last month. That's her?" The other partner was already fumbling for his phone, scrolling, his thumb shaking, looking for a name he should have looked up years ago. One of the cousins kept whispering, "No, no way. She's just Aviation," like saying it enough times could keep it true. And Crystal sat very still in the cream leather seat, one hand drifting up to the stolen necklace at her throat as the full shape of what was happening rolled over her like cold water. The whisper spread through the cabin like fire through dry grass. The heavy-set partner turned to the man beside him and hissed, "Do you understand what we just did? We sat here and laughed while a man threw his own boss off her own plane." The other partner had finally found the name on his phone, and his face had gone the color of paper. He slid the phone into his pocket like it had burned him. One of the cousins, the one who'd snorted loudest, now sat with both hands over his mouth. The young flight attendant, who had stood frozen by the galley the whole time, suddenly straightened her back and stepped to Aviation's side, the way the staff had always quietly known and never said. One by one, the people who had spent the last 10 minutes enjoying a woman's humiliation realized they had been clapping at their own funeral, and Kofi laughed, because that is the only thing a falling man knows how to do on the way down. He laughs even as the ground rushes up to meet him. "Owner, you." He looked at Aviation like she was a stranger who had wandered on board. You wouldn't know how to..." And then he stopped, because Aviation had taken her foot off the stairs. She stepped back into the cabin. and everything about her had changed. The bag was no longer clutched against her chest like a shield. Her shoulders were no longer curled inward. She walked back up that aisle, slow and even, and she carried herself like the floor itself belonged to her. Because it did. She reached into her bag. Crystal flinched. A cousin half rose, as if she might pull out something dangerous. She pulled out the little brass propeller pin. She held it up, and it caught the cabin light and threw a small, warm gleam across all their frozen faces. "My grandfather built this company out of one runway and a borrowed wrench," she said. Her voice was quiet. The kind of quiet you have to lean in to hear. The kind that makes a whole room go still to catch it. He flew when men spat at the idea of a man like him flying. And when this company was dying, choking on its debt, sold off in pieces, I bought it back, quietly, under another name, so that no man would ever look at me and see dollars instead of a wife. Every plane in this fleet, every route on that map, every pilot's pension these men tried to steal. She turned the pin slowly in the light. Today, this company is worth more than $2 billion, and I signed for this very jet with this little pin sitting right here, in my pocket. She turned to Crystal in the cream seat. "You're sitting in my seat," she said, not cruelly, just plainly, which somehow made it worse. Then her eyes dropped to the gold chain. "And that necklace was a gift. From him to me on a night he swore he'd give me the world. You can keep it. It never really meant anything to him anyway." She turned to Loretta, who was staring up with her mouth half open. "You told me, a few minutes ago, that I came into this family with nothing, and I'd leave with nothing." A small, sad smile touched the corner of her mouth. "You had it backwards the whole time. You came into my sky with nothing. Every flight you bragged about, every trip you sneered at me on, you were a guest the entire time. And by tomorrow morning, you're going to understand exactly what that means." Then, last of all, she turned to her husband. The man she had loved when he had nothing. The man who used to hold her face in both hands. The man who, 2 minutes ago, had wrapped his hand around her arm and dragged her toward an open door in front of the whole world. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply said 6 quiet words, soft as a door easing shut. "You never once asked who I was. And that, not the jet, not the company, not the empire, that was the most devastating thing of all." For 6 long years, the truth had lain beside him in the dark every single night. All he ever had to do was turn over and ask one honest question, and he'd been so busy chasing a smaller, shinier life that he never even thought to. The cabin stayed silent. The business partners would not meet her eyes. The cousins shrank into their seats. Loretta had begun, quietly, to cry. Kofi's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But nothing came out. The man who had so much to say 2 minutes ago suddenly had no words left at all. The fall came fast. It always does, for people who built their pride on top of someone else's foundation. And here's the thing about Ifeoma. She did not scream for revenge. She did not have to. The truth was the avalanche. All she had done was speak one quiet word at the top of the mountain and let gravity do the rest. She walked to the front of the cabin and laid a gentle hand on the captain's shoulder. "Captain Elijah," she said softly, "would you take everyone back to the terminal, please? I think this flight is over." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he set his cap back on his head with the quiet pride of a man who had waited 30 years to do exactly that. By the time the staircase touched the tarmac again, The whole careful arrangement of that family had already begun coming apart at the seams. Kofi had spent years living as if the empire was his. The house in the hills, the cars in the driveway, the black cards, the front row seats, the whole glittering life. And every last piece of it flowed out of the company Ifeoma owned. None of it had ever been in his name. Not the house, not the cars, not even the jet he'd just tried to throw her off of. By the next morning, the cards stopped working at the register. The driver did not come. The business partners, the same men who'd laughed in that cabin, quietly pulled their deals, because no one wanted to be in business with a man who would publicly humiliate the woman who signed the checks. The so-called friends stopped answering their phones, the way friends always do the second the cream runs dry. Crystal was the first to vanish. Of course she was. She had never wanted Kofi. She had wanted the seat, the shine of it all. And the second she understood the seat had never belonged to him, she was gone before the sun went down. She left him a single one-line text, and she never spoke to him again. She kept the necklace. It was the only real thing she got out of any of it. Loretta tried a different road. A few days later, she came knocking, but not on her son's door. She came knocking on Ifeoma's. The sunglasses gone now, the pride gone too. She stood on the step and talked about family, about forgiveness, about how she had always seen something special in Ifeoma, how she had only ever wanted what was best for everyone. Ifeoma listened to the whole speech, patiently, kindly even. Then she answered, "I forgive you, Loretta. I truly mean that. Carrying anger would only weigh down my flight, and I have somewhere I'd rather be going." She paused, and her voice stayed gentle. "But forgiveness and a key to my house are two very different things." And she closed the door, softly, the way her grandfather taught her. The way her grandfather taught her. The river that runs the deepest makes the least noise. As for Kofi, the hardest fall belongs to the man who realizes too late what he threw away with his own two hands. He had not actually lost the wealth because it had never truly been his to lose. What he lost was far worse. He lost the one person on this earth who had loved him when he was broke and frightened and nobody at all. He'd held real gold for 6 years and traded it for something shiny that turned out, in the end, to be glass. He came to the airfield once, just once. He stood at the gate and asked to see her. Captain Elijah walked out to meet him, the way an old guard meets a man who no longer belongs inside. "She's flying today," the captain said, not unkindly, just true. "Will she ever talk to me again?" Kofi asked. His voice was small now, all the bigness gone out of it. The old pilot looked at him a long, long moment. Then he glanced up at the sky, where a small plane was climbing through the afternoon light, catching the gold on its wings. "Son," he said, "you spent 6 years telling that woman where she belonged. Back of the room, off the plane, out of the family." He nodded toward the climbing plane. "Turns out she belonged up there the whole time, and you belong right here on the ground with the rest of us, thinking long and hard about why." And he turned and walked back through the gate, leaving Kofi alone on the wrong side of the fence, watching the sky carry her away. A year went by. The company under Ifeoma's quiet hand did not just survive, it soared. New routes opened. New planes joined the fleet, each one with that same name on the tail. Her grandfather's name, the one she finally stopped hiding. Magazines that never knew she existed now put her on their covers. And at the bottom of every story, in the smallest print, was a line that made her smile. "Runs the company her grandfather built." She stood one evening on a stage in a bright hall, accepting an award for what she'd done for the people who flew for her, the pensions she'd saved, the old pilots she'd brought home. She wore a simple dress, no sparkle. She didn't need it. When she walked to the microphone, the whole room rose to its feet, the same kind of important people who once let a man call her his assistant. And in the very back of that room, near the doors, the same place they used to seat her, stood Kofi. He hadn't been invited. He'd come anyway, just to see her from a distance. He stood there in a suit that no longer fit the life he had, watching the woman he threw off a plane be celebrated by a room full of people who would have killed for 5 minutes of her time. He watched her smile. He watched her shine. He watched the whole world finally see what had been sitting beside him in the dark every night for 6 years. The world he'd promised to give her, and instead tried to take away. Their eyes met for 1 second across that long room. Just one. Ifeoma did not glare. She did not look away in pain. She simply looked at him the way you look at a place you used to live. And then she turned back to the crowd and kept speaking. That was the punch. Not hatred, not tears, indifference. The complete and total peace of a woman who no longer needed him to be sorry. They say he drove for hours that night with nowhere to go. The house was gone. The cars were gone. Crystal was gone. The friends who used to fill his phone had all gone silent. He ended up parked on that same hill outside the city, the one where he'd taken Ifeoma on their very first date, with gas station sandwiches and a sky full of planes. He sat there alone and watched the jets climb out of the airport, the way they used to, and somewhere up in that dark sky was an empire he had stood inside for 6 years and never once seen. He had told her he would give her the whole world. In the end, she had owned it all along, and he had been too blind, too proud, too hungry to notice the queen sitting quietly beside him. Kofi left before she finished. No one stopped him. No one even noticed him go. But the award was not the thing she was proudest of. That same year, on the old one-runway field her grandfather built, Ifeoma opened a flight school, a real one. She named it after Pops, in big letters across the hangar she'd rebuilt with her own 2 hands, and she filled it with kids from the dust road towns nobody ever flew out of, kids who'd been told their whole short lives exactly where they belonged. She paid for their lessons. She brought in the old pilots, Captain Elijah first among them, to teach them how to read the wind. On opening day, she stood at the back of the hangar. She liked the back now, by choice, where she could watch, and saw a little girl in borrowed shoes stare up at a plane with the same hungry wonder Ifeoma once had on a wooden crate. And something in her finally healed all the way through. The man who once promised to give her the world had taken her necklace, her seat, and her name. But he could never touch this. This was hers, and now she was giving it away by the planeful, and no one would ever again decide for these children where their sky ended. Some weeks later, that small dust road town in the south got a quiet visitor. A woman in simple clothes, no entourage, drove out alone to a little one-runway airfield at sunset. She had bought it back and restored it. The very field where, long ago, an old man with leather hands once lifted a little girl onto a wooden crate so she could see over the propellers. Ifeoma stood at the fence and watched the sky turn gold. The little brass pin sat over her heart, where it always did. She thought about Pops, about the thing he told her all those evenings ago. The ground keeps trying to tell you where you belong, but the sky don't care where you came from. For 6 years, she had let people tell her she didn't belong. Not on the jet, not in the family, not in the life. And the truth she carried the whole time in a small worn pin against her heart, was that belonging had never been theirs to give her, and never theirs to take. It was hers. It always had been. Before you judge someone, remember this. The quietest person in the room may be carrying the biggest story. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Never mistake silence for lack of power. Some people don't fight to be noticed. They simply wait for the truth to speak for them. As the last plane touched down on her grandfather's runway, Ifeoma finally smiled. Not because she won, not because they lost, but because she was finally free. If this story touched your heart, type, "She belonged in the sky," and don't forget to subscribe for the next unforgettable story.